Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War and specifically to talk about Thrones of Decay for Immortal Empires in Total War Warhammer 3. And maybe Realms of Chaos as well, though I think Creative Assembly is outright trolling if they make any kind of content right now for Realms of Chaos. It just isn't worth it, and it is resources that could be spent elsewhere, specifically Immortal Empires. Now, I understand that there are some people that still play Realms of Chaos, but it's just a really horrible campaign map that isn't conducive towards having great gameplay. The only kind of value for Realms of Chaos is if you're interested in seeing the cinematics, like say you're playing the Chaos Lords or even the Shadows of Change Lords, you might want to see the cinematics. Realms of Chaos is the easiest way to do it in the fastest possible way. But outside of that, in terms of actual gameplay, it is an awful experience, and to fix it, they would basically need to overhaul the map, and frankly, at this point, it's just not worth the effort. Don't get me wrong, I would very much prefer if Creative Assembly was willing to make more limited maps. I think there is a significant amount of value in that, but they're probably not going to undertake that kind of effort. But just an idea, like we've seen with the Old World mod, how people can be very interested in how a different kind of map than what Creative Assembly has designed can work exceptionally well. Like, I'm actually looking forward to spending quite a bit of time in the Old World map once it is more updated and better, because it's like we just have an early beta version of it. Now, let me be clear on this. If Creative Assembly screws up with Thrones of Decay, that might just be it. I doubt Sega will shut them down. Don't never assume that a company will do otherwise, especially when they've lost $100 million because of the screw-ups within a particular developer, and that's exactly what has happened with Creative Assembly. They poured $100 million down the toilet with hyenas, and they're making less money right now. Pharaoh sold very poorly, and there's a lot of discussion, like, apparently some of the leaks, and I didn't see this when watching Bellular's video, but there are people talking about like how people in Creative Assembly have been saying that Forge the Cast Dwarves did not meet sales expectations, which is a bit surprising, to be honest, considering the fact that there are a lot of people that did play Forge the Cast Dwarves. The trailers for Forge the Cast Dwarves got a significant number of views. So it is very surprising to hear the idea that Forge the Cast Dwarves didn't sell as much as Creative Assembly wanted it to. Though, given the fact that they increased the price by a significant amount, maybe that isn't necessarily so surprising for them. Though it should be pointed out that Creative Assembly likely made a significant amount of money. They just didn't make the bank that they wanted to. Like, assuming that 80 developers, and that's a fairly high number, it's likely closer to 40, maybe even lower depending on the source you're going with. But assuming 80 developers worked on Forge the Cast Dwarves for 6 months and then released it, well, they maybe spent $2 million to develop Forge the Cast Dwarves, market it, voice acting, etc. They would have made that money back and a decent amount of profit with 200,000 copies or even 150,000 copies. They would have broken even about 150,000, maybe even less than that. And it is quite likely that Forge the Cast Dwarves sold fairly well, just not to the ridiculous extent that Creative Assembly expected it to. Then again, given the fact that they increased the price and they haven't fixed significant issues, maybe it's not surprising. And then they increased the price of Shadows of Change, which did very poorly. Like, there were fanboys arguing, oh, they're still going to make money with Shadows of Change, they're still going to sell copies. Well, apparently not necessarily as much as you might think. And then Total War Pharaoh, it sold 50,000 copies based on information that has been leaked. Not a great situation for Creative Assembly, and they've probably lost money with Pharaoh, actually. Especially because with certain editions, they did promise DLC, like it's part of those editions. So they have a DLC plan. People have been working on those DLCs quite likely even before the game launched, and now Creative Assembly is in a bind where they basically have a DLC plan for a game that just sold very, very few copies. So when they release those DLCs, they're not really going to make money on that. So they're going to lose money on Pharaoh. Or they'll have to cancel the DLC, but that creates a bunch of legal complications for Creative Assembly, so they might just have to bite the bullet, so to speak, on that one. This brings me to Thrones of Decay. Now, some people have talked about, maybe they should finish Shadows of Change first, maybe lower the price. I find that highly unlikely. Don't get me wrong, I would very much like to see them do so. But them adding more content and fixing Shadows of Change, like fixing Kislev, improving Cafe, fixing Siege, that is highly unlikely. That boat has sailed. That's the thing that pisses me off as someone who's a fan of Kislev, that Shadows of Change should have been the DLC that fixed both Kislev and Siege. And it didn't. And the race that got the most amount of improvements was Cafe, which was the race that needed them the least. Now, don't get me wrong, Cafe didn't need those improvements. It still needs improvements, but Kislev and Siege do need improvements far more than Cafe did. That is a completely different discussion, though. But suffice to say, Creative Assembly screwed up with Shadows of Change. But if they screw up Thrones of Decay, that's going to be pretty much it. Because Thrones of Decay isn't just going to be any other DLC. It's not just going to be a Lord pack where if it doesn't work out, they can wash their hands with it. No. With Thrones of Decay, you have a DLC that's going to affect 3 races. The Empire, Dwarves, and Nurgle. Now, let's assume that if they don't fix Nurgle, if they don't improve the situation for Kugaf, they can get away with that. It would still piss off a decent number of people off if they didn't fix Nurgle, if they didn't improve Nurgle, and Nurgle does need those improvements to economy, to unit recruitment, to just the overall campaign situation, to plagues as well. Nurgle does need some genuine level of improvement. But really, the worst thing that Creative Assembly can do with Thrones of Decay is not fixing the Empire, not fixing the Dwarves. Now, there are some fanboys that argue that the way the Empire plays out and the way the Dwarves play out is perfectly fine. Well, I'm just going to say it bluntly. The vast majority of the player base disagrees with that assessment. And if Creative Assembly thinks that the way the Empire and Dwarves play out right now, the way their campaign mechanics work out, the way their army rosters work out, if they think that's fine, then they can just slap a Lord pack on those races and call it a day. That's not going to work out. And I've made this point before, I'll make it again. The Empire and Dwarves are 2 of the most popular races in the setting, especially the Empire. If they screw up, if they don't genuinely and vastly improve the campaign experience for the Empire as a whole, for all the Legendary Lords of the Empire and for all the Legendary Lords of the Dwarves, that is going to blow up in their face to a biblical level. If you think there's been a controversy surrounding Creative Assembly so far, I don't think you've seen how pissed off the Warhammer fan base, forget the Total War fan base, how pissed off the Warhammer fan base can be when you screw up. Because for all the fanboys, for all the people that do buy Total War because they're Warhammer fans, there's just as many people who are very likely liable to want to burn Creative Assembly to the ground if they fuck this up. Just gonna put that out there. So the goal ultimately should be to not screw it up. But if they do screw it up, it's going to end very badly with them, for them. And going forward, they might end up like BioWare, which hasn't released any kind of worthwhile game in, half a decade, even longer, really. And the last 2 games that BioWare released, Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda, were disasters. And now we keep waiting for Dreadwolf, we keep waiting for the new Mass Effect game. But basically, that's the fate that might await Creative Assembly. And they're not BioWare. BioWare has a very long-standing and active fan base that will buy their games when they come out. Like, they weren't willing to buy Anthem, but there were still plenty of people that did buy Andromeda, though they quit it very shortly thereafter. Creative Assembly is not BioWare. They're not Blizzard. They can't screw up to the same level and expect that people will still buy their products. If Creative Assembly screws this up, then it's going to make things more difficult. And here's the thing, even if they do release Thrones of Decay in a great state as a DLC, it is not going to be enough to fix the anger that their own fans have towards them right now. It can be a start. So Creative Assembly can either choose to go down the path where they improve their situation, they release quality products, and their fans start buying them again because they didn't buy Shadows of Change, they didn't buy Pharaoh. They can either go down that path, or they can release another DLC that's overpriced and as low quality as Shadows of Change. That is the decision, the fundamental decision for Creative Assembly right now. If they release a quality DLC at a decent price, then that will soften the blows that we've been dealing with as of late. If they don't, it's going to blow up in their face and they might not be a game developer for much longer. I can't imagine that Sega is just going to tolerate this at this point. They might have been willing to tolerate a lot of other things because ultimately a lot of the screw-ups that Creative Assembly has been responsible for, Empire, Napoleon, Attila, Rome 2, and Free Kingdoms, those games, those products still made them a significant amount of money. But now, Creative Assembly is not making them a significant amount of money. They're losing money. They've lost over $100 million. That is an enormous failure. It was the biggest game, people have reported this, it was the biggest game ever made by Sega. It was the biggest failure by far for Sega. And in fact, it might just be one of the biggest failures in video gaming as a whole. I can't really think of that many cases where a company put $100 million on the line, lost it all, and they just walked away from that. I've seen games fail. I've seen major controversies. I've seen games sell less well than they should have. For instance, Infinite Warfare for Call of Duty, there was a huge controversy with that. But you can imagine that game still sold a lot of copies and actually would end up being far better for the controversy because Activision did change things. With respect to that, something is going to change. Sega is not going to approach Creative Assembly in the same way that they've approached them in the past. So hopefully that might change the way things are done within the company. But if Creative Assembly keeps going under, and the player base for Warhammer 3, the active number of users for Total War Warhammer 3 has dropped off a cliff. From much of Warhammer 3, after the launch of Immortal Empires, the concurrent player base was around 20,000. Right now, the concurrent player base for Warhammer 3 has dropped below that. I've seen it go down as low as 13,000. Things are looking up. Like right now it's 19,000 as I'm recording this at the moment. So it's a fairly steady player base. But if they screw up for Thrones of Decay, that just might be it. And don't be surprised if Thrones of Decay ends up being a massive failure that ends up dropping below 10,000. One of the things that, by the way, might be helping Warhammer 3 right now is like the old world situation in certain mods. But if CAE is not capable of fixing some of the fundamental issues that have existed in the game for a long time, it's not going to end very, very, very well for them. In fact, it's going to end extremely poorly for them if they screw that up. That's what I have to say on that subject. Now, what do I think they need to do? That's the most relevant question. What does Creative Assembly need to do with regards to Thrones of Decay? Well, first and foremost, they need to lower the price. $25 for Shadows of Change was absurd. You can buy games at a similar price or maybe just a bit more expensive full games, not a Lord Pack. No Lord Pack for any game should be charged like that. That is ridiculous. That is absurd. Creative Assembly is acting as if it's Electronic Arts or Activision, and even they would probably hesitate at that kind of price point. Though, given some of the things I've seen from Activision Blizzard as of late, maybe not so much. But again, Activision and Blizzard are two different companies from Creative Assembly. Creative Assembly does not have that kind of following. They don't have that many people willing to tolerate this stuff. Yes, plenty of people did buy the previous DLC because guess what? The DLCs we got for Warhammer 2, a lot of them were fairly high quality DLCs that genuinely improved the game. Shadows of Change is the worst DLC that Creative Assembly has released in half a decade. Minus things like the Day 1 DLC like Ogre Kingdoms, that's pretty crap. But outside of like those kind of marketing DLCs like Ogre Kingdoms, Shadows of Change is the worst DLC by far, at least for a Total War game that wasn't abandoned like Free Kingdoms, because there were certainly bad DLCs for Free Kingdoms as well. But absolutely the worst DLC for the Warhammer Total Wars in half a decade. They need to lower the price. By how much? Well, I personally think that any kind of price point higher than the Champions of Chaos, which already was a price increase, let's not ignore that. Any price point higher than Champions of Chaos is not justifiable. Unless it's a race pack. And even a race pack should only be like $20. Yes, Forge the Cast Wars was overpriced. We tolerated it because it was very high quality, but this was a huge discussion going in the lead up of Forge the Cast Wars, which may not have done so well. But regardless, Creative Assembly needs to lower the price. By how much? That's a different discussion. But regardless of what kind of quality that will exist in Thrones of Decay, if they release it for $25 again, or they do some gimmicks like, oh, it's 10%, 20% off the pre-order bonus, that is going to go very, very poorly for them, even if they release an amazing piece of content. It will not work. I'm saying this outright. It will not sell what they wanted to sell and will enrage people even further. In terms of the content itself, what does Thrones of Decay need? Well, you can get away to some extent with not fixing Nurgle, though yes, Nurgle needs to be fixed. Better recruitment, better campaign mechanics, better plagues, the building situation needs to be improved. This is the thing that's so infuriating about a lot of the issues that you see, like the faction balance. A lot of them could be easily fixed. In fact, modders already do this to improve it. Though of course Nurgle could use more unique campaign mechanics. Kugav could use more unique campaign mechanics to make him stand out. That's one of the things that needs to happen. But it's the smallest issue. Like, if Creative Assembly treats Nurgle in the same way they treated the Changeling, where they don't fix the underlying race, but they make a new campaign where the Lord is very, very powerful, that could work. Though, to be fair, it will end up working the same way as the Changeling, which is a very, very boring campaign to play, and one of the worst campaigns in the game. Very powerful Lord, horrible to actually play. But then you have the Empire and Dwarves. What do the Empire and Dwarves need? Imperial Authority needs to be completely removed from the game. It's a horrible system, or needs to be reworked. But it needs to be reworked in such a way that perhaps it's more similar to how the political system works for the cast Dwarves, like the Conclave system. You have a political system that ends up working significantly better than the crap we have with Imperial Authority. Yes, Karl Franz should worry about defending the Empire, but it shouldn't be a system where you get screwed over because some minor AI faction gets destroyed by a legendary lord who is meant to destroy them, like Draika, Festus, Vlad, the Changeling, Kazrak. That is the annoying fact to deal with. Now, part of this is a map issue. Like, you would be surprised how good the Empire can be to play in something like the Old World mod, where it's just more spread out. It's not so easy for these legendary lords to wipe factions out. Like, because right now it's very crowded. The map feels extremely crowded between the legendary lords. It's very easy to go from one settlement to another, and that means that minor factions, can be wiped out far more easily. Maybe the minor factions get a buff when you're playing like a Karl Franz or Balthazar Guild campaign. That could help out with it. But the current system of Imperial Authority, where you need to reach a high level of fealty, then have Imperial Authority to spend to confederate, is just a frustrating system. The High Elves do it better. The Chaos Dwarves do it better. The Dark Elves do it better when it comes to this. Or even Cathay. Like, look at Cathay, Dark Elves, High Elves, Chaos Dwarves. They all work significantly better. Like, with Chaos Dwarves, you have a reason to keep the others alive, and you will have a reason to help them out, because eventually you will confederate them, and they'll actually be useful because they're major factions, they're not minor factions. The Electrocounts are useless factions. Like, the only one that's worth confederating if you're playing Karl Franz is Gelt. He's the only one that's going to give you a genuine advantage. The rest of them, they're just going to give you some territory, which in every other campaign in the game, you would just take naturally. Like, Cathay just uses the basic diplomacy system. The High Elves use the same diplomacy system, though sure, you might want to wipe out Safari and Tyrannoc. But outside of that, which I always thought was a bit ridiculous anyway, but all the same, like with Cathay, like if you're playing Cathay, you never want to declare war on another Cathay faction, or you have no reason to. You can still do it if you want to, but you can just end up confederating them for diplomacy. It is incredible to think that the basic diplomatic system works just far better than some kind of gimmicky system that we have in Imperial Authority. Don't get me wrong, I want to keep the items, I want to keep the Electrocount State Troopers, but the system of Imperial Authority needs to go. And this is a conclusion I've reached even with mods that improve Imperial Authority and make it less punishing and far better than it is. It still really feels like a very gimmicky system, and I just don't like using it in a lot of ways. That's one of the problems. When we're talking about the other campaigns, Marcus Wolfhard and Hostility Meter, I think he should have a way of getting rid of all the negative effects, because it just makes his campaign a pain to play when you just get a rogue army full of units. It kind of made sense in Warhammer 2, but Warhammer 2 was a very different beast. And even then in Warhammer 2, it wasn't that great of a system for Mortal Empires. His campaign was awful in Mortal Empires. Let's not ignore that. So that needs to be updated. And then you have the Books on Nagash. The Books on Nagash in themselves need to be updated. The way you acquire them, you should be able to acquire them from military alliances. I mean, hell, the Chaos Dwarves can acquire things from military alliances. It's just a difference between Chaos Dwarves and the way the Books on Nagash work. Before it can acquire artifacts, incredibly powerful artifacts by making alliances with certain factions. Why the hell does that now work for the Books on Nagash? I don't know. And I think like Volkmar's campaign just doesn't really make sense. I think there was certainly a push to diversify starting locations in Warhammer 3 that didn't end up working so well. Like, I understand why we got there, because when Warhammer 1 launched, there were a lot of people angry, like Lorem would start in the same location as Wargrim, for instance. And so Creative Assembly has pushed for that greater diversity, but I think they went way too far with Warhammer 3. And this, by the way, applies to dwarves. Because Grombrindal will be on the other side of the map. Kind of makes sense, but doesn't really make sense for his character. But I'll get into the dwarves in just a bit. On top of that, like on top of the campaign mechanic issues, the Empire does have a decent economy. That works out. It is annoying with certain buildings, like you can only recruit certain units with certain buildings, and certain units are very difficult to acquire. The Empire has a decent unit roster. The problem is artillery is tier 4. Well, guess what? By the time you get to tier 4 in any bloody province as the Empire, you're pretty much done with the vast majority of the important parts of the campaign, with the exception of the in-game crisis, and that's it. It creates a really annoying situation, because it means that what you're going to do in the early game, you're going to use archers, you're going to then get crossbowmen, and then you're going to get as many warrior priests as possible. Like, looking at Legend of Total War, how he plays the Empire, he masses warrior priests and archers. That's essentially it. It's not a great campaign design. Like, the unit roster is there. Great swords, huntsmen, artillery. It would be really fun to play with all of that, but the units are far too difficult to acquire. I think great swords should be a tier 2 unit. I think there's some rebalancing that needs to happen for the sake of single player when we're talking about like the Imperial Infantry roster, because a lot of it is crap. In fact, no infantry unit of the Empire, with the exception of Spearmen or Shields, and for phalanx protection and great swords, are war fusing. Elector Count State Troopers are generally war fusing, and regiments ran, of course, but we're talking about basic recruitment of units, not the special unit recruitment. Then you have artillery. Requiring tier 4 for a great cannon, which is so important considering all the sieges we might have to deal with in a campaign, is really, really frustrating to deal with. So that's another thing that needs to change, I think, when we're looking at the Empire. On top of that, the generals and heroes of the Empire, especially the ones that launch with Warhammer 1, so Imperial generals, captains, witch hunters, they need an update to actually be worth using in a campaign. They need special skill lines, they need choices, consequences for those choices, all that. Warrior priests and arch-electors work just fine. Huntsmen in general are kind of useless because they just struggle to do damage. One of the problems of the game is the way range combat is handled. Like, these are just things, like what I'm talking about is racial specific things, but let's not ignore the siege situation, the range situation, the way combat animations feel. Like, just load up Warhammer 2 and see a ranged unit firing at one another, and note the difference between Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 3. There is a major difference between those games. Or a cavalry charge in Warhammer 2 versus 3 is pretty astounding. Like, yeah, Warhammer 2 had better battles, minus the AI benefits, the AI cheats they got. Warhammer 3 is better on the campaign side of things in every respect, but it's worse in terms of how the battles feel. That is just a perspective I have on that subject. But yeah, those are the things that Empire needs. What about the dwarves? The poor, miserable dwarves. Here are some of the basic things they need. And I say very basic. Their research tree is a bloated mess. Their growth is too low, far too low. They have the worst growth in the entire game. And I don't care how much people say, oh, the dwarves are fine with a slower playstyle. That doesn't work within the context of Warhammer 3. And besides, the idea that the dwarves are going to be limited in terms of how their economy is based on growth is a ridiculous notion to begin with. The problem with the poor growth for the dwarves is it limits how many heroes you can have. It limits your army variety, it limits your economy, and the overall potential of that economy. I think the dwarves really need the construction system similar to the chaos dwarves and the resource system similar to the chaos dwarves. So as opposed to using laborers, they could use oath gold for that purpose, as well as other things. People have also just suggested an underground transportation network between the various dwarven holds, which would make a lot of sense from a lore perspective. I also do genuinely believe Belegar should start closer to Caracade Peaks as opposed to having that long-ass journey to get there. The Old World mod puts him significantly closer to it, so you actually end up having the War of Caracade Peaks actually playing out in that particular campaign. So starting position for Belegar, I think, should really be changed. His upkeep situation also should be changed from my point of view, because he suffers an enormous penalty early on, and then once he gets Caracade Peaks, he's basically steamrolling, assuming that the campaign situation doesn't screw him over. It's not a great campaign to play. Ungrim needs a reason to actually use Slayers and a reason to play his campaign. Grombrindle really should have a campaign mechanic similar to Oxyatl, where he's trying to help dwarves in need, because that's what the Grombrindle does in the lore. From other perspectives, I think Creative Assembly also needs to change the dynamic for the dwarves when it comes to their army. And they need casualty replenishment. They need a way to increase casualty replenishment either for a hero or for research. Chaos Dwarves showed you can have decent casualty replenishments or good casualty replenishment without having to rely on the same method a lot of other people use, which is to get a hero that gives you casualty replenishment. The Chaos Dwarves do it for research, they do it for conclave seeds, they do it for faction effects. It does work quite well for them in their campaign, and I think the dwarves could copy a lot of things from the Chaos Dwarves. Now, not everything, there's obviously some unique elements, but that the Chaos Dwarves should have, but I do genuinely think like the template, the things that the Chaos Dwarves implement, at least some of those things should apply to regular dwarves, because one, it makes sense, two, it would make their campaigns far less boring. One of the problems, though, for the regular dwarves is that you have no reason when you're playing a dwarf campaign to use anything other than Quarrelers and Grudge Throwers early on. Sure, you might get Iron Drakes and better artillery later on, but the mainstay of all of your armies is going to be made up of Quarrelers. And while this is certainly an issue other races do have, I think the dwarves are certainly in one of the worst positions when it comes to this. Worse than the elves. Like, elves, you can say high elves have a one-dimensional army, but that's not quite true, because elves have cavalry, they have flying units that are actually worth recruiting. There's no reason to recruit gyrocopters and gyrobombers in a campaign. And of course, we can talk about dwarven mechs, we can talk about thunder barges. There's a lot of things Creative Assembly could add to the dwarves, and hopefully Thrones of Decay will have an engineering focus for the dwarves to really improve their campaign situation. But that's all I had to say. Christine signing out. I do think that, yes, the Empire, Dwarves, and Nurgle do need to be vastly improved. I do also believe that they need to lower the price. That's really the fundamental aspects of this. Stay tuned for more, and if you do enjoy my content, consider supporting me via PayPal and Patreon. I do greatly appreciate it.